That cold morning, no one expected an act of kindness to change everything. What started as another day on the road became a story the whole town tried to explain, and few had the courage to tell. Before we begin, subscribe and turn on the bell. Here we show that behind the engines and the leather there are still human hearts. The desert wind howled low across the cracked asphalt of Route 66, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and diesel exhaust. It was the kind of December dawn that settled heavy in your bones, the sky a bruised gray over the outskirts of Dustville, Arizona, a forgotten speck on the map where neon signs flickered like dying stars against the cold. The Iron Hawks had rolled in the night before, their Harleys lined up like silent sentinels outside the Rusty Spur diner, engines long since cooled, the metal still ticking faintly in the chill. They weren't here for trouble. The Brotherhood had learned long ago that the road demanded more than fists and fury. This stop was routine, coffee black as midnight, a chance to stretch legs numb from hours of highway hum. Inside the diner, the air hung thick with the aroma of burnt grease and fresh percolated coffee, the kind that could wake the dead. Worn vinyl booths sagged under the weight of truckers and locals, their conversations a murmur like distant thunder. At the counter, Elena Ramirez wiped down the scarred Formica with a rag that had seen better days, her hands moving in slow, deliberate circles. She was 38, with lines etched around her eyes from too many double shifts and not enough sleep, raising her boy alone after his father rode off into a sunset that never came back. The diner was her world, 50-cent refills and the occasional tip that meant Christmas dinner instead of ramen. In the corner booth, the Iron Hawks kept to themselves. Jax Harlan, the club's quiet anchor, nursed a mug of Joe, his calloused fingers tracing the rim. At 45, he carried the road in his weathered face, a salt and pepper beard hiding scars from a life that had tested him more than once. He'd founded the Hawks not for glory, but for the unspoken pact. Watch each other's backs, extend that watch to those who couldn't fight for themselves. Beside him sat Tommy, the youngest at 29. His leather vest patched with the club's emblem, a hawk in mid-flight, wings spread wide. And there was Marcus, the mechanic, fiddling with a napkin, his eyes always scanning, always weighing the room. They weren't loud. Their presence was a low rumble, felt more than heard. The bell above the door jingled sharply, cutting through the diner's haze like a knife. In strode Victor Langford, the billionaire who'd bought up half the town's land last summer, turning dusty lots into gleaming strip malls that no one could afford. He was a man built from boardrooms and backstabbing, his tailored wool coat a stark contrast to the faded denim around him. Flanked by two security types in crisp suits, he carried the air of someone who owned the very oxygen he breathed. But today, he wasn't alone in his entitlement. Trailing behind was a rented Santa Claus, belly-padded and beard synthetic white, hired for some corporate feel-good event at the community center down the block. Langford had insisted on starting the morning here, at the quaint local spot, as he called it, to hand out branded gift bags to employees, a PR stunt wrapped in red ribbon. The diner fell quiet as Langford's eyes swept the room, landing on the counter where old Harlan Jenkins mopped the floor. Jenkins was the janitor, 72 and bent like the desert willow outside, his overalls threadbare and his hands gnarled from decades of scrubbing other people's messes. He'd worked the community center for 30 years, invisible as the dust he swept away, living in a trailer on the edge of town with nothing but faded photos and regrets. No family left, his wife gone to cancer, his son lost to the streets years back. Jenkins paused his mopping, leaning on the handle, his breath coming in shallow wheezes from lungs scarred by years of inhaling bleach and neglect. Langford approached the counter with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Santa shuffling behind him like an awkward shadow, The billionaire pulled a gift bag from under his arm, shiny plastic emblazoned with his company's logo, and dangled it toward Jenkins. "Here you go. Merry whatever," he said, voice smooth as polished marble. But then his gaze hardened, taking in the janitor's worn boots, the tremble in his grip. "On second thought," Langford added, loud enough for the room to hear, "you probably don't deserve this. Look at you, barely keeping this place clean. My employees earn their bonuses. You just push a broom." He snatched the bag back, tossing it onto the counter with a dismissive flick, the crinkle of plastic echoing like a slap. Santa shifted uncomfortably, his gloved hands twisting the hem of his suit. The diner froze. Elena's rag stilled mid-wipe, her knuckles whitening. The truckers at the far booth exchanged glances, forks hovering. Jax Harlan's mug paused halfway to his lips, his jaw tightening just enough to notice if you knew where to look. Tommy's eyes narrowed, a flicker of heat behind the calm, while Marcus crumpled the napkin in his fist. Jenkins stood there, head bowed, the mop handle creaking under his weight. No outburst, no plea, just a long, heavy silence that pressed down like the winter sky outside. His eyes, watery and distant, fixed on the floor, where a single droplet of rain from his earlier pass with the bucket pooled and spread. But in that silence, something shifted. Jax set his mug down with deliberate care, the porcelain clinking softly against the saucer. He rose, his boots scraping the linoleum, and the Brotherhood followed without a word, a quiet ripple of movement that drew every eye. Langford turned, smirk fading as he sized them up. The leather, the ink peeking from collars, the unyielding stares. "What's this?" he blustered, his security men stepping forward. "You got a problem." Jax didn't raise his voice. He just looked at Jenkins, then back at Langford, his words low and steady. "Yeah, we do." The wind outside picked up, rattling the windows, as if the desert itself held its breath. What happened next would unravel everything, the masks, the judgments, the hidden weights men carry like chains. But in that moment, as the rain began to patter against the glass, the crowd in the diner sensed it. The real story wasn't about gifts or greed. It was about the quiet fire in soul society had long written off. The rain came down in earnest now, a steady drum against the diner's tin roof, turning the parking lot into a slick mirror of blurred neon. Jax Harlan stood unmoving, his broad shoulders casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the space between him and Langford. The billionaire's face flushed a shade deeper than the holiday lights strung crookedly above the counter, his security men hovering like poorly trained dogs, hands twitching toward their belts, but Jax's gaze didn't waver. It was the kind of look that had quieted bar fights and mended broken roadsides without a single raised fist. Behind him, Tommy shifted his weight, the leather of his vest creaking softly, while Marcus let the crumpled napkin fall from his fingers, forgotten on the booth seat. Elena watched from the counter, her rag forgotten in her fist, the damp cloth dripping onto the floorboards. She'd seen men like Langford before, city suits rolling through Dustville like they owned the horizon, leaving behind contracts that choked the life out of small dreams. But the Iron Hawks, they were different. Whispers in the diner painted them as ghosts of the old highways, riders who fixed what others broke without asking for thanks. Now, as Jax took a single step forward, the air thickened with the scent of wet earth seeping under the door, mingling with the bitter edge of cooling coffee. "Deserve?" Jax repeated the word slowly, letting it hang like smoke from a dying fire. His voice was gravel-low, worn smooth by years of wind-whipped confessions shared around campfires. He wasn't yelling. There was no need. The diner had gone still, save for the patter of rain and Jenkins' ragged breathing, each exhale a faint rattle in the quiet. The old janitor hadn't moved, his gnarled hands still gripping the mop handle like it was the only anchor left in a world gone adrift. A single tear traced a path down his weathered cheek, catching the fluorescent light before splashing onto the puddle at his feet. Langford straightened his coat, the fabric whispering against itself, and forced a laugh that came out brittle. "This is ridiculous. We're just handing out gifts, my gifts, to people who matter, not some. Some floor scrubber who's probably never held a real job in his life." His eyes flicked to Jenkins, then back to the bikers, calculating the odds. The security guards edged closer, their polished shoes squeaking on the linoleum, but Jax ignored them, his focus pulling the room into a tight orbit around the counter. Tommy spoke up then, his voice younger, edged with the rawness of someone who'd lost too much too soon. "Real job? Like buying up land. Folks have lived on for generations, then jacking the rent so they end up on the streets." He didn't advance, but his words landed like pebbles in a still pond, rippling through the onlookers. A trucker at the far end of the counter nodded almost imperceptibly, his fork clattering against his plate. Elena felt a knot loosen in her chest. These men, with their patched vests and road-dusted boots, were voicing what she'd swallowed for months: the slow erosion of Dustville under Langford's empire. Marcus, ever the fixer, glanced at Jenkins and saw the man's shoulders sag further, the weight of decades pressing down. He'd known types like the Janitor back in his army days, quiet souls who patched tents and mended gear without complaint, only to be overlooked when the medals were handed out. "Let him have the bag," Marcus said evenly, nodding toward the gift on the counter. "It's Christmas. Ain't about deserving. It's about not being a damn fool in front of folks who see through you." The Santa, poor rented soul with his fake beard wilting in the humidity, cleared his throat, the sound muffled and awkward. He was just a local actor, mid-40s, playing the part for extra cash to cover his kids' braces. His eyes darted between Langford and the bikers, pleading silently for this to end, without fallout. Langford shot him a glare that could curdle milk, then turned back, his voice rising a notch. "You leathernecks think you can intimidate me? This town's mine now. I build progress. You just ride around pretending you're relevant." But the words fell flat, absorbed by the growing murmur from the booths. A waitress in the back, Lila, single mom to 3, her apron stained from the breakfast rush, set down her tray with a soft clink, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the spark of something long dormant. She'd lost her husband to a factory closure Langford's conglomerate had orchestrated years back, and now, watching Jenkins stand there diminished, she felt the pull of unspoken solidarity. The Iron Hawks weren't storming in like avengers. They were simply there, a wall of quiet resolve, their presence peeling back the billionaire's veneer layer by layer. Jax reached into his vest pocket, pulling out a worn wallet, the leather cracked from endless miles. He slid a 20 across the counter toward Elena, who hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. "Coffee for the house?" he said, his eyes meeting hers for a brief, steady moment. It was a small gesture, but in the diner's hush, it echoed like a promise. Elena nodded, her fingers brushing his as she took the bill, the warmth of human contact cutting through the chill. Jenkins finally lifted his head, his eyes meeting Jax's for the first time. There was no gratitude spoken, just a flicker of recognition. Two men, shaped by roads less traveled, carrying burdens that showed in the lines of their faces. The rain outside intensified, sheets of it blurring the windows, isolating the diner in a cocoon of grey. Langford snatched the gift bag again, crumpling it in his fist, but the damage was done. The crowd's eyes had shifted, no longer on him, but on the janitor and the riders who refused to let cruelty stand unchallenged. As the security men ushered Langford toward the door, the bell jingling mockingly behind them, Jax placed a hand lightly on Jenkins' shoulder. The touch was brief, calluses against faded denim, but it lingered in the air like the scent of rain-soaked sage. The old man exhaled, a sound like wind through dry branches. And for the first time that morning, his grip on the mop eased. The Iron Hawks returned to their booth, the tension uncoiling slowly, but the diner's pulse had changed. Whispers started, not of judgment, but of quiet awe. In Dustville, where the desert swallowed secrets whole, this was the beginning of truths unearthed, one steady heartbeat at a time. The afternoon sun broke through the clouds like a reluctant witness, casting long shadows across the diner's parking lot, where puddles from the morning rain still shimmered like forgotten mirrors. The Iron Hawks had lingered after the confrontation, their Harleys gleaming under the weak light, engines silent but for the occasional drip of condensation from the exhausts. Jax Harlan wiped a smudge from his handlebar with a rag pulled from his saddlebag, the motion deliberate, almost meditative, as if the simple act could smooth the edges of what had unfolded inside. Tommy leaned against his bike, arms crossed, staring out at the endless stretch of Route 66 where heat mirages danced on the horizon. Marcus busied himself checking tire pressure, the hiss of air punctuating the quiet, but his eyes kept drifting back to the diner door. Inside, the air had thawed somewhat, the scent of reheated chili and cooling pie mingling with the damp earthiness that clung to everyone's clothes. Elena moved behind the counter with renewed purpose, pouring fresh coffee for the regulars who'd stayed. Their conversations now laced with low murmurs about Langford's retreat. Jenkins had shuffled to a stool in the back, the mop bucket pushed aside, his hands folded in his lap, as if holding onto the remnants of his dignity. No one pressed him for words. The old man's silence was a language all its own, etched in the furrows of his brow, and the way his fingers trembled faintly against his knees. Lila, the waitress from earlier, slid a plate of untouched apple pie toward him, the crust flaky and golden under the diner's fluorescent hum. "On the house, Harlan," she said softly, using his first name like an old habit. Jenkins looked up, his eyes cloudy but kind, and managed a nod that carried the weight of unspoken thanks. He'd known Lila since she was a girl braiding wildflowers by the roadside, back when Dustville still felt like a community instead of a casualty of progress. Now, at 72, he saw in her the same quiet endurance that had kept him sweeping floors long after hope had worn thin. The pie steamed gently, its cinnamon warmth cutting through the chill that lingered in his bones. But he only picked at it, each forkful a small act of persistence. Outside, the desert wind picked up again, whispering through the sagebrush that bordered the lot, carrying the faint tang of gasoline from a passing semi. Jack straightened, tucking the rag away, and glanced at his brothers. "We stick around," he said, voice low enough that it blended with the breeze. It wasn't a question. The Hawks operated on instinct, honed by years of shared roads and shadowed histories. Tommy nodded, his jaw still set from the morning sting, while Marcus capped the tire gauge with a click. They weren't vigilantes, not in the flashy sense. Their justice was the kind that simmered beneath the surface. Born from nights spent pulling strangers from ditches or standing guard over families shattered by circumstance. Word of the diner standoff had already begun to ripple through Dustville, carried on the wings of phone calls and sidelong glances. At the community center down the block, where Langford's corporate Santa was supposed to spread cheer, the event had fizzled under a cloud of awkward tension. Volunteers, mostly locals scraping by on part-time gigs, whispered in the kitchen, their aprons dusted with flour from cookie trays that now sat cooling untouched. "Those bikers," one said, a middle-aged mechanic named Ray with grease under his nails. "They didn't touch him, but you could see it in their eyes, like they were holding back a storm." His wife, a nurse at the clinic, shook her head, her scrubs still carrying the faint scent of antiseptic. "Society calls them trouble, but who stood up when that suit humiliated old Jenkins? Not us." The judgments ran deep in a town like Dustville, where the Iron Hawks were painted as relics of a wilder era. Leather-clad wanderers who roared through on weekends, leaving empty bottles and exhaust in their wake. Preachers from the white-steepled church on Elm Street warned of their influence, lumping them with the drifters who panhandled at the gas station, but those whispers ignored the truth. The Hawks had wired electricity to a widow's trailer last spring, no questions asked, or towed a stranded family van during a sandstorm without a dime in payment. Jax himself had once spent a night in the county jail for disturbing the peace, but it was only because he'd shielded a battered woman from her husband's rage. His fists clenched, but never swung until the law arrived to sort it. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of rust and gold, Elena stepped out the back door of the diner for a smoke, her break stolen from the slowing rush. The air was crisp now, laced with the promise of evening chill, and she found Jenkins there, sitting on an overturned crate, staring at the horizon where the road blurred into nothingness. "You okay?" she asked, lighting her cigarette with a flick that sparked briefly in the fading light. He didn't answer right away, just exhaled a breath that fogged the air, his hands clasped tight to ward off the cold. "Seen worse," he finally muttered, voice rough as gravel. "But that hurt different. Like being invisible ain't enough. Gotta be worthless too." Eleanor leaned against the wall, the brick rough against her shoulder, and watched the smoke curl upward. She'd felt that sting herself, tips drying up as Langford's malls siphoned customers away, leaving the diner a ghost of its former bustle. "Those riders in there," she said, nodding toward the lot. "They saw you, really saw." Jenkins's eyes softened, tracing the line of Harleys where the men now shared a quiet word, their silhouettes etched against the sunset. For a moment the weight lifted, just a fraction, the shared silence of outcasts recognizing their own. Inside the community center, Langford paced the lobby, his phone pressed to his ear, voice clipped as he barked orders to his PR team back in Phoenix. The Santa costume hung limply on a rack, its beard askew, a symbol of the morning's unraveling facade. But even as he plotted his next move, perhaps a lawsuit or a smear in the local paper, the crowd outside began to gather subtly. A few locals drifting by the diner windows, eyes on the Hawks, not with fear, but with a dawning curiosity. The biker's humanity wasn't shouted. It unfolded in the way Jax handed Jenkins a spare jacket from his bike, the wool heavy with the scent of leather and road dust, or how Tommy shared a story in low tones that drew a faint smile from the old man's lips. The evening settled in, neon signs buzzing to life along the strip, their glow reflecting off wet asphalt like distant campfires. Dustville breathed easier now, the moral suspense of the day hanging in the balance, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet alliances forming under the stars. Jenkins pulled the jacket closer, its warmth seeping into his frame, and for the first time in years, the road ahead didn't feel quite so empty. Comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories of courage and loyalty can travel. The night deepened over Dustville, the kind of dark that pressed in from all sides, broken only by the erratic flicker of the diner's neon sign and the distant hum of a freight train slicing through the desert. Inside the rusty spur, the booths had emptied, leaving behind the faint ghosts of conversations, crumbs on tables, rings of condensation from forgotten glasses. Eleanor locked the front door with a soft click, the key turning like a reluctant confession, and leaned against the glass for a moment, watching the Iron Hawks in the parking lot. Their figures moved in the low light of a single flood lamp, shadows stretching long across the gravel, as if the earth itself were trying to hold on to their secrets. Jax Harlan stood apart from his brothers, his back to the diner, staring out at the black ribbon of Route 66 that vanished into the horizon. The wind tugged at his vest, carrying the sharp bite of creosote from the scrubland, and he felt the familiar ache in his shoulder. A remnant from a crash years back when the road had taught him the cost of looking away. He'd seen the look in Jenkins's eyes earlier, that hollow defeat mirroring his own from a lifetime ago, and it stirred something buried deep, a moral pull he couldn't shake. The Hawks weren't here to play heroes. They rode for the forgotten, the ones society swept underfoot like so much dust. But tonight, standing up for the old janitor had cracked open a door Jax had long kept chained. Tommy approached him quietly, boots crunching softly on the cooling asphalt. A thermos of coffee in hand, black, steaming, the way they liked it after long hauls. "You think Langford's done?" he asked, voice low, threaded with the caution of someone who'd learned trust was a luxury. At 29, Tommy still carried the raw edges of his past. A stint in juvie for defending his sister from a stepfather's fists. Then the open road with the Hawks as his only family. He handed Jax the thermos, the metal warm against the chill, and they both took a pull, the bitter liquid grounding them in the moment. Jax capped it slowly, his breath visible in the night air. Men like him don't quit. They double down. He glanced back at the diner, where through the window Jenkins sat alone at the counter, nursing a cup Elena had left for him before heading to the back to count the till. The old man's silhouette was slumped, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, no longer bowed quite so low. Earlier, after Langford storming out, Jenkins had murmured a few words to Jax. "Ain't nobody stood for me like that since my boy was little." It was the first crack in the janitor's silence, a hint of the life he'd tucked away like faded photographs in a drawer. Marcus joined them, wiping his hands on a rag stained with engine oil, the scent clinging to him like a second skin. He'd overheard the exchange inside, and now his mechanic's mind turned over the pieces. Langford's empire wasn't just land grabs. Whispers from the garage suggested he'd undercut local jobs, including the community centre where Jenkins had toiled for decades. "Heard from Ray at the shop," Marcus said, his voice steady, but laced with the quiet fury of a man who'd fixed more than bikes, broken lives too. Langford's pushing to shut down the centre, turn it into another of his storage units. Jenkins'll be out on his ass come New Year's. The words hung heavy, mingling with the distant rumble of thunder rolling in from the west. Jax's jaw tightened, a muscle flickering under his beard. But he didn't lash out. Instead, he nodded toward the diner. "Then we make sure that doesn't happen without a fight." It was the biker code speaking. Loyalty beyond blood, justice in the spaces law forgot. But beneath it simmered the internal storm. Jax had his own ghosts, a daughter he'd lost custody of after a custody battle twisted by his lifestyle. The judge's words still echoing like exhaust fumes. Standing for Jenkins felt like redemption, a way to protect what he couldn't save in his own life. Inside, Jenkins pushed his cup away, the porcelain scraping faintly against the formica. The diner was empty now, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the tick of a wall clock that had seen better decades. He pulled the jacket Jax had given him closer, its leather warm and unfamiliar against his skin, carrying the faint musk of long miles and campfire smoke. For 30 years, he'd mopped these floors and the center's halls without complaint. Invisible labor for a town that barely noticed. His son Eddie had been the light, bright-eyed kid with dreams of college, until a car wreck on a rain-slicked road took him at 19. Jenkins had buried the grief deep, letting it harden like the desert floor. But tonight, it surfaced in the tremor of his hands, the way his breath caught at the memory of Eddie's laugh. Elena emerged from the back, her apron untied, hair falling loose from its ponytail. She slid onto the stool beside him, the vinyl creaking under her weight, and poured herself a splash of coffee from the pot. "You don't have to go home to that trailer alone tonight," she said softly, her voice cutting through the quiet like a gentle rain. She'd lost her own husband to the bottle, leaving her and her boy to scrape by, and in Jenkins she saw the same quiet suffering. The Hawks. They're good people. Stayed after closing to make sure you're all right. Jenkins met her eyes, the first real spark in them since morning. Why'd they do it? For a nobody like me? His words were rough, edged with the doubt of a man who'd long accepted his place on the margins. Elena paused, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup, the steam rising in lazy curls. Because they know what it's like to be judged. Leather and engines don't make monsters. It's the suits who forget we're all just trying to hold on. Outside, the thunder grew closer, a low growl that mirrored the rising tension in the air. Langford wouldn't let this slide. Already his security men had been spotted circling the block in a black SUV, headlights cutting through the dark like accusatory beams. As if on cue, the diner's phone rang, shrill and insistent in the stillness. Elena answered, her face hardening as she listened. "Yeah, he's here. No, you can't speak to him." She hung up with a click, turning to Jenkins. "Langford's people. Threatening to fire you if you don't apologize for causing a scene." The old man's face paled, but before he could respond, Jax pushed through the door, the bell jingling softly, his brothers close behind. Rain began to fall in fat drops, pattering against the roof, turning the lot into a symphony of quiet urgency. "We heard," Jax said simply, water beading on his shoulders as he approached the counter. He placed a hand on the worn wood, close enough for Jenkins to see the faded tattoo on his knuckles, a hawk's wing, symbol of flight from chains. "You apologize for nothing. We ride with you on this." Tommy and Marcus flanked him, their presence a shield, not of aggression, but of unyielding compassion. The moral choice loomed now, sharper than before. Walk away or stand firm against a man who wielded power like a weapon. Jenkins rose slowly, the jacket settling around him like armor. For the first time, his voice held a note of resolve, cracked but steady. "Then let's show 'em what Dustville's made of." The rain intensified, washing the windows in sheets, but inside, the air warmed with the fragile spark of alliance. Langford's shadow loomed larger, promising escalation. Yet in that shared silence, the Hawk's loyalty ignited something deeper, a redemption woven from the threads of hidden pains, pulling the outcasts together against the storm. The rain hammered down on Dustville like a judgment long overdue, turning the diner's parking lot into a churning sea of mud and reflected neon. Jax Harlan stood just inside the doorway, water streaming from his beard in rivulets that traced the lines of his face, each drop cold against skin already numb from the wind. The bell above him had fallen silent, but its echo lingered in the humid air, mingling with the sharp scent of wet leather and the faint, acrid tang of exhaust from the Harleys parked in a defiant row. Jenkins hovered near the counter, his borrowed jacket zipped tight, the fabric dark with rain that seeped through the seams. His hands, gnarled and steady now, gripped the edge of the stool, knuckles pale against the wood. Elena flicked off the diner's main lights, leaving only the glow from the kitchen fluorescents to cast long, wavering shadows across the empty booths. The phone call from Langford's people still hung in the room like smoke, its threat coiling around them all, the promise of dismissal, of Jenkins' trailer lights going dark come payday. She wiped her hands on her apron, the motion automatic, but her eyes darted to the window where the black SUV idled at the curb, its engine a low growl cutting through the downpour. "They're watching," she murmured, voice barely above the rain's roar. "Like vultures!" Tommy paced near the door, his boots leaving wet prints on the linoleum. Each step, a contained burst of energy he reined in with visible effort. At 29, he was the spark in the Hawk's quiet fire, the one whose compassion often tipped into a protective fury he'd learned to temper on endless stretches of blacktop. "We can't just sit here," he said, glancing at Jax, his breath coming in measured huffs that fogged the glass when he peered out. The SUV's headlights pierced the sheets of water, illuminating the faces inside. 2 security men, their postures rigid, phones pressed to ears as if reporting back to their master. Tommy's fist clenched at his side, not in threat, but in the ache of memory. Nights spent shielding his sister from shadows, much like these, the road, his only escape. Jax placed a hand on Tommy's shoulder, the touch firm, grounding, a silent reminder of the code that bound them. "We don't rush. Rushing gets people hurt." His voice was steady, but inside the tension twisted like a wrench on a stubborn bolt. Jax had walked away from too many battles, ones that left scars deeper than the one in his shoulder, and now Jenkins' quiet resolve mirrored his own buried regrets. The daughter he'd lost to a judge's gavel, her small hand slipping from his during that final court visit. The weight of it pressed harder tonight, fueling a controlled rage that simmered beneath his calm. He turned to Jenkins, meeting the old man's eyes in the dim light. "You sure about this? Langford's got lawyers thicker than desert flies. Could drag you through mud worse than this rain." Jenkins straightened, the jacket creaking softly with the movement, its unfamiliar bulk a shield against more than the cold. For decades, he'd swallowed slights like dry sand, mopping up after lives that never glanced his way. But the morning's humiliation had cracked something open, a fragile defiance born from grief's embers. His son Eddie's face flickered in his mind. That last Christmas, with a handmade card and dreams unfulfilled. And now this, strangers willing to stand where family had faded. "Ain't got much left to lose," he replied, his voice rough but threaded with a warmth that surprised even him. A faint tremor ran through his fingers as he released the stool, but his gaze held steady, reflecting the compassion in Jax's stare. Marcus, ever the observer, moved to the window, peering through the rain-streaked glass without touching it. His hands, still carrying the faint scent of oil from earlier tinkering, hung loose at his sides. In his army days, he'd seen men like Langford, commanders who wielded rank like a club, leaving the grunts to clean the mess. "SUVs blocking the road to the center," he noted quietly, his words precise, cutting through the storm's din. "Probably waiting to tail us if we head there. Langford's event wrapped early, but he's not done stirring." The community center loomed in their thoughts, its faded holiday lights now a battleground. Jenkins' job, the town's fragile heart, all under threat from a man who saw progress in erasure. The internal conflict gnawed at them, a slow burn in the chest. Jax felt it deepest, the pull between walking away, preserving the Hawks' low profile on the margins, and stepping into the fray for a man who'd become more than a stranger in hours. Loyalty demanded action, but compassion whispered caution. One wrong move, and the fragile trust in Dustville could shatter. Tommy stopped pacing, his breathing evening out as he leaned against the counter, eyes on Jenkins. "We could ride out now, draw 'em off, give you a head start to the trailer." But even as he offered, his voice held the strain of knowing it wasn't enough. The billionaire's reach extended further than headlights. Elena stepped forward, her apron discarded on a chair, revealing the simple sweater beneath. Worn thin from washings, she'd watched her own world shrink under pressures like this, tips vanishing as Langford's shadow grew, and now the diner felt like the last outpost of resistance. "No," she said, her words soft but resolute, hands clasping together to still their subtle shake. "We face it together. The center's got folks depending on it, kids like my boy, getting meals when school's out." Her eyes met Jax's, a shared understanding passing in the pause, the air heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth drifting in from the cracks around the door. Outside, the SUV's door opened, a figure stepping into the deluge, an umbrella blooming like a black flower, shielding one of Langford's men as he approached the diner. The rain drummed on the fabric, muting his footsteps until the bell jingled again, admitting a gust of wet wind and the sharp cologne of authority. He was younger than the others, suit rumpled, holding a manila envelope sealed with wax that gleamed under the lights. "Mr. Jenkins," he called, voice clipped, ignoring the bikers, as if they were fixtures. "Mr. Langford requests your presence at the center to discuss compensation for the disruption." The word hung, laced with implication, apology or eviction. Take your pick. Jenkins' breath caught, a faint wheeze in the quiet, but Jax moved first, positioning himself between the messenger and the old man without a word. The security man faltered, umbrella dripping onto the floor, his eyes widening at the wall of leather and resolve. Tommy and Marcus closed ranks subtly, their presence a quiet escalation, compassion fueling the rage they held in check. "Tell your boss," Jack said, low and even, the rain's rhythm underscoring his words. "We'll all be there, but on our terms." The man backed out, envelope clutched tight, the door swinging shut behind him with a final, echoing chime. The SUV peeled away, tires hissing on wet asphalt, leaving the group in a charged silence, broken only by the storm. Jenkins exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just a fraction, while Jax felt the moral weight settle heavier. The choice made, the conflict rising like the floodwaters edging the lot. In the dim diner, under the relentless rain, their alliance hardened, a brotherhood extending beyond blood, ready to confront the shadows with the steady light of unspoken justice. The road ahead twisted darker, but in that shared breath, compassion held the line against the gathering storm. The rain had eased to a mournful drizzle by the time the group stepped out of the diner, the night air thick with the mineral scent of soaked earth and the faint ozone of distant lightning. Jax Harlan led the way, his boots sinking slightly into the muddied gravel, each step deliberate, as if testing the ground for hidden snares. The Harleys waited like faithful shadows, their chrome dulled by water droplets that caught the sporadic flash of passing headlights. Jenkins walked beside him, the borrowed jacket hanging heavy on his frame, its sleeves brushing against his thighs with every uneven stride. Tommy and Marcus flanked them, engines rumbling to life, with a low, throaty growl that vibrated through the chest, while Eleanor locked the diner door one last time, her keys jingling softly before she slipped into the passenger seat of Marcus's battered pickup, the truck's wipers sweeping arcs across the windshield. The convoy rolled toward the community center, a low-slung building on the edge of town where holiday lights dangled like weary promises from the eaves. The black SUV was already there, parked crookedly under a sodium lamp that buzzed faintly, casting an orange pallor over the scene. Langford stood on the steps, coat unbuttoned despite the chill, his silhouette sharp against the open door, where warm light spilled out like an invitation laced with barbs. Two more security men loomed nearby, their umbrellas folded now, faces impassive masks in the drizzle. The billionaire's eyes narrowed as the Harleys pulled up, their engines cutting off in unison, leaving a ringing silence broken only by the patter of rain on metal roofs. Jax dismounted first, swinging his leg over the seat with the ease of long habit, his hand steadying Jenkins as the old man eased down from the truck. No words passed between them, just a shared glance that carried the weight of the unspoken, the moral precipice they'd crossed together. Tommy killed his bike's headlight, the sudden dark swallowing the lot, while Marcus parked the truck with a gravel crunch, his door creaking open to release the faint scent of oil and damp upholstery. Elena stayed inside for a moment, her breath fogging the glass, watching as the group approached the steps. Her hands twisted in her lap, the strain of the evening etching faint lines around her mouth, but she followed soon after, her sneakers splashing through shallow puddles. Langford descended a step, his polished loafers avoiding the wet, voice slicing through the night like a cold blade. "Jenkins, you show up with this circus? Thought I made myself clear. Apologize." and maybe we forget the scene you caused." His gaze flicked over the iron hawks, dismissing them with a curl of his lip, but there was a flicker of unease in the way his fingers drummed against his thigh. The security men shifted, hands hovering near pockets, the air thickening with the promise of escalation. Inside the center, faint voices murmured, volunteers wrapping up the aborted event, their eyes peering through the windows like cautious birds. Jenkins halted at the base of the steps, rain tracing rivulets down his face, mingling with the lines of age and exhaustion. His breath came in shallow bursts, visible in the lamplight, but he held his ground, the jacket's collar turned up against the wind. Jack stood a pace behind, his presence a quiet bulwark, while Tommy's jaw clenched, the controlled rage in his eyes reflecting the internal storm of loyalties tested. Marcus scanned the shadows, ever the sentinel, his mind already mapping exits and angles, the compassion in his stance belying the veteran's instinct for conflict. It was then, in that suspended moment, that the hidden truth cracked open, reframing the night like a sudden break in storm clouds. Langford sneered, stepping closer, his shadow falling over Jenkins. "You think these road rats can save your sorry job? I've seen your file. Lost your kid in that wreck, haven't you? Pathetic. No wonder you're sweeping floors. Can't even keep a family together." The words landed like a gut punch. Casual cruelty meant to diminish, but they ignited something in Jax, a flash of memory so vivid it stole his breath. He stepped forward, his hand instinctively reaching toward Jenkins, but his voice emerged rough, edged with a grief long buried. "Eddie," Jack said, the name slipping out like a confession, low and raw, his eyes locking on the old man's. Jenkins froze, his face paling under the lamp's glow, recognition dawning slow as the rain's chill seeped deeper. You knew him?" The janitor's voice trembled, not with fear, but with the ache of a wound reopened after years of careful stitching. Jax nodded, the drizzle beading on his lashes, blurring the edges of the world. He'd been 25 then, fresh from the service, riding through Dustville on a solo run when the call came. A twisted wreck on a rain-slicked curve, a young kid named Eddie, pinned in the mangled remains of his old Chevy. Jax had been first on scene, pulling over at the screech of metal, his hands slick with blood as he held the boy's head steady, whispering assurances while sirens wailed in the distance. Eddie had gasped out fragments, a dad waiting at home, dreams of engineering school, a laugh that cut through the pain like sunlight. Jax had stayed until the end, the weight of that night forging a silent vow. Protect the vulnerable, honor the lost. He'd never told the Hawks the full story, carrying it like a scar under his vest. The reason he'd founded the club, not for rebellion, but for redemption, for the father he'd become in those final moments, holding a stranger's son as life ebbed away. Jenkins' eyes welled, the connection hitting like a thunderclap, reframing the morning stand. Not random kindness, but a thread from the past, loyalty closing a circle decades in the making. You were the one, the rider who stayed. He told me, before, said you made it not so scary. His hand reached out, trembling, clasping Jax's forearm, the calluses meeting in a grip that spoke volumes. The drizzle softened to mist, the air heavy with the scent of wet pine from the center's lone tree, and for a heartbeat the world narrowed to that touch. The grieving father recognizing the man who'd eased his son's passing. Langford faltered, the revelation hanging in the air like unspoken judgment, his bluster cracking as the security men exchanged uneasy glances. Tommy's breath hitched, understanding dawning in his widened eyes, while Marcus placed a steadying hand on Jax's back, the Brotherhood's compassion wrapping around the moment like a shield. Eleanor, witnessing from the truck's shadow, felt her throat tighten, the human drama unfolding in subtle gestures, Jax's shoulders sagging under the released weight, Jenkins' faint nod carrying forgiveness for a pain neither had chosen. but the tension coiled tighter, Langford recovering with a forced scoff. Touching, but this changes nothing. Sign this. He thrust the envelope forward, papers rustling wetly. Or you're done here, all of you. The moral conflict surged. Sign and survive in silence or defy, risking everything for the justice that bound them. Jax's grip tightened on Jenkins' arm, his voice emerging steady through the mist. It changes everything. The center's door creaked open wider, locals spilling out now, their murmurs rising like a tide, eyes on the riders not as outcasts, but as bearers of a deeper truth. The night held its breath, the revelation igniting a quiet fire, pulling the margins into the light as the storm's remnants whispered of battles yet to come. If this story already has your heart, hit the like button. It helps the story of Jax Harlan reach more people who still believe in humanity. The mist clung to Dustville like a veil of half-forgotten regrets, softening the edges of the community center's facade as the group stood frozen on the steps. Jax Harlan's hand lingered on Jenkins's arm, the grip a bridge across years of unspoken loss, the rain's remnants tracing cold paths down their faces. The sodium lamp hummed overhead, its orange light pooling on the wet concrete, casting elongated shadows that danced with the subtle sway of nearby branches. Langford's envelope hung limp in his hand, the papers inside sodden and curling at the edges, a symbol of power dissolving in the night's quiet insistence. The billionaire's face twisted, caught between bluster and the dawning realization that his script had unraveled, his security men shifting uneasily behind him like statues weathering a thaw. Inside the center, the murmurs of the locals swelled into a low wave, spilling out through the open door. Volunteers with aprons still tied, their hands dusted with the remnants of holiday baking, eyes wide with the weight of the unfolding truth. Ray the mechanic stood at the threshold, his grease-stained fingers flexing at his sides, while his wife, the nurse, clutched a forgotten tray of cookies, the scent of vanilla and cloves wafting faintly into the damp air. They'd heard fragments, Jax's name tied to Eddie's final hours, a story whispered in hospital corridors years back, now blooming into something tangible, human. No one spoke loudly. The revelation carried itself on breaths held too long, on the subtle nods exchanged between strangers who'd long shared the town's margins. Jenkins released Jax's arm slowly, his fingers lingering as if reluctant to sever the connection, his breath emerging in a ragged sigh that fogged the mist. The grief in his eyes softened, not erased, but reframed by forgiveness unspoken. A quiet absolution for the rider who'd become a fleeting father in his son's last moments. "You carried that all these years," he murmured, voice barely rising above the drip of water from the eaves, each word heavy with the survival that had kept him sweeping floors through empty dawns. Jax met his gaze, his own chest tightening with the release of a burden he'd hauled like an unbalanced load on endless highways. The moral suspense of the night crested here, not in shouts or shoves, but in the shared silence of men who'd lost pieces of themselves to roads, both literal and shadowed. Langford thrust the envelope forward again, his voice cracking like thin ice. "This is nonsense. Sign it, or I'll have you all arrested for trespassing. Forums, threats, whatever sticks." But the words fell flat, absorbed by the growing circle of onlookers who now edged closer. Their footsteps soft on the slick pavement. Elena stepped up beside Jenkins, her sweater damp at the shoulders, her presence a steady anchor born from her own quiet battles. Nights alone with her boy, scraping coins for meals while the world moved on. "You've taken enough from this town," she said, her tone even, laced with the compassion of someone who'd learned to forgive without forgetting. The security men exchanged glances, their postures loosening as the crowd's quiet resolve mirrored the Hawk's own, loyalty not in leather alone, but in the web of lives intertwined on Dustville's frayed edges. Tommy's hands unclenched at his sides, the rage that had simmered through the evening cooling into something deeper, a protective warmth that echoed his own guarded heart. He'd seen his sister's eyes light with similar recognition once, after he'd pulled her from harm's way, and now, watching Jax and Jenkins, he felt the brotherhood extend beyond the club's emblem, a code that forgave past silences and defended the vulnerable without fanfare. Marcus nodded subtly to Ray, a mechanic's shorthand of solidarity, the air between them thick with the unspoken justice of men who fixed what power broke. No fists flew. The confrontation unfolded in pauses, in the way Langford's shoulders slumped imperceptibly, his envelope lowering as the weight of witnessed humanity pressed in. The billionaire exhaled sharply, crumpling the papers in his fist, the rustle lost in the night's hush. Fine. Keep your jobs. Your pity party. But this town's changing, whether you like it or not. He turned abruptly, his coat flapping like a defeated wing, barking at his men to follow as the SUV's engine roared to life, tires spinning briefly in the mud before finding purchase and vanishing into the mist-shrouded road. The taillights faded, red smears against the dark, leaving behind a silence that settled like cooling asphalt after a summer storm. The group lingered on the steps, the center's warm light now a beacon rather than a trap. Jenkins leaned against the railing, his breath steadying. The jacket Jax had given him a tangible reminder of second chances woven from hidden pasts. Volunteers approached slowly, offering thermoses of hot cider that steamed in the chill, the cinnamon scent mingling with wet earth and relief. Lila from the diner pressed a hand to Jenkins' shoulder, her touch light, maternal, a single mother's compassion bridging the gap society ignored. Jax watched it all, his heart aching with the quiet victory of loyalty over law, the redemption found not in grand gestures but in the subtle mending of fractured lives. As the night deepened, the Ironhawks gathered their bikes, engines humming softly to life without urgency, the vibration a gentle pulse against the quiet. Tommy clapped Jenkins on the back, a gesture rough but kind, while Marcus shared a low word with Elena about checking her truck's alignment come morning. Jax lingered last, his eyes meeting the old man's once more. "Ride safe," Jenkins said, the words carrying the forgiveness of survival, of outcasts finding strength in shared margins. Jax nodded, mounting his Harley with a creak of leather, the road ahead stretching infinite under a sky clearing to stars. Dustville exhaled as they rode out, the mist lifting to reveal the first hints of dawn on the horizon, a pale promise that in the silence between engines and heartbeats, humanity endured, one unspoken pact at a time. The desert wind whispered through the empty streets long after, carrying the faint echo of loyalty's quiet roar, a reminder that some stories heal not with noise, but with the steady turn of wheels toward tomorrow. Subscribe for more stories of compassion, justice, and redemption. Thank you for watching The Case of Billionaire Told Santa the Janitor Didn't Deserve Gifts. Seconds later, the crowd saw the real story. See you in the next one.